All right, so for this video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how you can auto sample virtual instruments and hardware instruments. And I'm going to use somebody else's YouTube channel to get you started because I spent a few days trying to figure out how I could auto sample instruments like my hardware synthesizers and like my virtual instruments so that I could take those samples and then put them onto my Maschine Plus hardware when I get it. I don't have it yet. And this is kind of a big deal because we won't be able to take a lot of virtual instruments with us on our Maschine Plus. So I started digging up all of these ways I could auto sample for Maschine. I found that you could use MainStage from Apple. I spent money on it and tried auto sampling instruments and bringing them into Maschine, but the samples were all over the place. The information, the metadata was wrong, and I'd have to kind of massage things, and it was a nightmare. I was going to make the video for you anyways using that software, and the day I was about to do that, a YouTuber named Av McCree put out a video for MPC users on how to use the auto sampler built into the MPC. Now here's the kicker. I watched his video, which is great, and he is an awesome YouTuber. Make sure you go subscribe to his channel. He likes to give us Maschine users a bit of a hard time every now and then, but I'm pretty sure he's just having fun. So I watched Av's video, and he is showing us Mpc Beats, which is a free program, Mac or PC. So why not? Download the software, try it out, and sure enough, we can export the samples out of Mpc Beats and bring them into Maschine. What I'm going to do now, get you to go watch his video, and then I will pick it up after that, and we will show you how to take those samples and put them into Maschine. Because I'm not going to hijack his video. Go give him those views, then come back here. I'm going to go through just a couple extra things with the software as far as what we need to do to take this into Maschine. Okay, so make sure you watch that video, especially if you're going to use hardware synthesizers, because he talks about setting up the MIDI ins and outs, and that is very important for sure. So first off, this is Mpc Beats. Go to the MPC website, look for the Mpc Beats software. It's free. Click the download button. And then what you got to do is you go in here and you go to Preferences, and you're going to go to Plugins. And then make sure you turn on the VST folders and then scan them. Otherwise, your virtual instruments aren't going to show up. Once you've done that, then of course you can follow the instructions to sample a virtual instrument with this little plugin button. And then over here, he went through and showed how to sample a MIDI instrument, so a hardware synthesizer, with the actual MPC hardware, which we don't have in here. I'll just run through a couple quick things here with you. You click on the MIDI tab right there, and then this little button right here is where you're going to turn on this MIDI out port. It's very important that you turn that on because we need to send MIDI information out of Mpc Beats into your hardware synthesizer. So we click the out port, and then I make sure that's hooked up to whatever MIDI you have hooked up to your system. And you might have this just hooked up through Maschine, so you would choose the Maschine ins and outs right there. Once you've done that, now this should be sending information in to Mpc Beats from your synthesizer and back out to your synthesizer from Mpc Beats. So if I click on this little keyboard here, I'm sending MIDI information out to my hardware synthesizer. And in this case, I'm using the Korg Poly 800, an old synthesizer I got at an auction for like $75, which was a killer deal. I then have to follow the same steps he showed you. For the auto sampler, just go up to Tools, Auto Sampler, and there we can choose, like you said, make sure you've got your input set up and your outputs. So I'm going to set this up the same way he suggested, and we can see minimum note, maximum note. You get to choose that kind of stuff for yourself. I found the best results happen when I just set the note stride to 3. And then the only other thing I will add here is you can turn on layer 2, 3, or 4, or whatever, and you can not only sample the loudest velocity of your synthesizer or your virtual instrument, but you can sample the 96 velocity value of your synthesizer too. So I'll show you how that works once we get into Maschine. And then the other thing I would say, 5 seconds for note length is pretty good. And then here you can set your loop start and end points. I would just leave those probably on the default, but I did find I was cranking up my note length to something more like 5 seconds, just because it's not taking up that much space. We're not talking about a ton of space here, especially if you have a huge SD card for your Maschine Plus. So another thing I noticed is the crossfade here, the samples, that doesn't matter. It doesn't seem to get transferred over to Maschine. We'll see what that looks like in a second. And then that's it. So we go make current program, I click do it, and it's going to sample the notes on my Poly 800. So the next thing we need to do is something that you wouldn't have to do if you were going to keep playing in the Mpc Beats software, obviously. So what we need to do is we need to export this patch. So I'm going to go up to File, Export, and then MPC 5000 Program. And I'm just going to put it on my desktop into my auto-sampled folder, and we're going to call this Poly 802. So it's going to save those samples. Okay, so now once we get into Maschine, this is where things get interesting. And the first time I did this, I was very excited because, as I say, I tried all these different ways. I was ending up using programs to rename the files, to get them in order and stuff, and it was a nightmare. I will say one more thing there that you got to think about here is that Maschine has crashed on me when I was importing samples. So definitely make sure you save your project before you start messing around with this. I go to my Poly 802 folder, and I can see all of my samples for the Poly 800 right there. And all I have to do is go over to a group in Maschine. In order to get the zone menu to pop up, I did find I had to drag a sample onto the first sound just to get things started. Then I can delete that one, and now I can see the zone menu. If anybody knows how to get that open without, actually doing that first step, let me know, because I couldn't figure that out. Now that the zone menu is open, I can take these samples, I can drag them in, and I can put them on C1, C2, whatever I want. Now watch what happens. If I go all the way to the bottom, it puts them all on one spot. If I go a little bit higher, it starts to stretch things out. So I want this to go on C1. Doesn't really matter. Actually, I could put it on C2. We might as well do that just because that's the sample that I actually sampled. So if I keep pushing up now, up this one spot, you see that it's going to stretch out the samples according to a range. I sampled this every 3 semitones. So I need to make sure that my next sample starts on an E flat, so a C to E flat. So you can see now, C to E flat. If you mess that up, just erase them and then start over again, because you won't be able to do that sort of stretch thing once you're in here. Okay, so now I've got this stretched out all over the keyboard range that I need it. So you can see C1, I'm not getting anything, but C2, and it's going up the range. In order to use this properly, what you're going to want to do is take it off of one shot on the type. And if you can't see that, you might be on a different menu, so make sure you're on this little plugin menu right here. Then you can see the sampler. So make sure you're clicked on sampler. If you have effects or something, you won't see that either. Make sure you're on sampler, and then you go over to pitch or envelope. And on the hardware, you just hit the plugin instance button and make sure you're on the sound, and you'll see that as well. We've got type, one shot, and we just changed that to ADSR. I go back over to this menu right here. I click on that little waveform, and then I can see the zone. So I can see all of my notes, and I can play them. And the velocity has velocity sensitivity. It's mapped out all up the range until we get to the notes that we don't have it. So then what you could do, of course, there is you could remap this. Whoops, you see how I stretched that out and all of those came out? I don't want that. Make sure they're not all selected. And now I could drag this one sample all the way up to the bottom and this one sample all the way up to the top. Now it's going to play through the whole range of your keyboard. So another thing I noticed is that with virtual instruments, the note started exactly at the right spot. So right when you hit the note. But with sampled synthesizers or hardware synthesizers, I did a couple of them, there must be like a little bit of noise at the beginning that's kind of triggering the note start for the auto sampler. And so I did have a tiny little bit of sound at the beginning. So if I go over to edit right here, you'll see there's this tiny little bit of dead space. Now I could go to each sample and start it exactly like that, but that would be fairly time consuming. A way we can get over that is by going to the pitch and envelope settings of our sampler and just starting it a little bit later. So we can adjust the whole thing right here, and this will adjust every single sample that's on your list. So if I go and change it right here in this edit window, That's great, but when I go to the next sample, I would have to do that as well. So this start is a way to do it kind of globally for this whole patch. I still haven't figured out a way to, in Maschine, set things like the start time of a sample and this loop on all of the samples at the same time. Again, if somebody knows, please let me know. I don't think that's possible. So there's some workarounds that we have to deal with in those kind of things. And one way we can do that is just change this start right here. So if I go here, it takes a second for it to kick in. Just crank the percentage up right here a bit. Now I'm too far. Let's go back. So about 1.2%. And you'll see that's going to change on all of my samples. It's pretty nice. Now you'll also see that I've got my loop set. My loop points are set here as they were set in the MPC software, which is awesome. So we can have this loop range. But we can hear that there's a bit of a pop when we get to when the loop starts over. So that's where you would have to go in and dig in carefully on each sample, and that's going to be a bit of a pain. So what you'd have to do there is you'd have to go to the zone menu, which you could see on the hardware, and you could just turn the knob, or you could go to this control right down here, this loop crossfade. So say for, let's see, let's try this one. So I'm going to go to crossfade here, and I'm just going to crank this up maybe to about 1,000. Let's crank that even more. So you got to remember these are samples. We got 44,100 samples in a second. So that's a lot better right there. It's kind of a weird sound that has some bumps in it anyways, but that's how you would set the crossfade. And unfortunately, this is where things get to be a pain, because you'd have to go and do that for every sample. So what I would suggest is for things like pads and stuff like that you might be holding for a really long time, set your sample length in the MPC software to something like 10 seconds or even longer, 15 seconds. So you take these long samples of something like a pad, and then that way, chances are you won't even have a note that is longer than 15 seconds that is going to need to be looped. And if it does need to be looped, then you just go in and set it individually on each one of those samples. But otherwise, you'll probably get away with it without having too much difficulty there. So another thing I should mention is the fact that you need to play with the release. If your release is set to nothing, it's probably not going to sound great. So after you've set the type to ADSR, that means the envelope is attack, decay, sustain, and release when you let the note off. If you've got it set to ADSR, then make sure you play with the release value. And let's crank that right up. Okay, so now you have a little bit more natural release depending on the patch. In one of these patches, I took the mini brute and I sampled a pad sound. Let's drag that right in. So drag that onto the first sound, go to the audio menu, delete that, and I'm just going to drag this whole thing right in to C2, push it up just a little bit, follow the steps, go to the type, set it to ADSR, keep my release nice and high. And now I've got a polyphonic patch that I made on the Mini Brute 2S. So it's a monophonic synth, right? So very quickly, once you get your workflow down with this, you can save your patches and take your synthesizers kind of to the next level in some regards. And then also have this nice patch that is very small in size, and it's going to be super easy on the CPU on things like the Maschine Plus. And we'll find out what the CPU is like on those, but I'm guessing that the more samples we can use when we're playing standalone, the better. So that's why the software is just so great. I just can't believe that it's free. I really can't, and I'm quite excited about that. And one thing I did in Mpc Beats was to sample a cello. The cellos from Session Strings Pro 2, and what I did is I sampled them at 2 different velocity layers. and I'm going to click one of these cello samples and drag it right in onto sound 1, get rid of that. Then what I'm going to do is I actually am going to start with the softer ones, and I put these into 2 different folders after I got it out of the Mpc Beats. Drag them onto C1, and I'm going to push up, there we go, up to the E flat. So now I've got my cello samples. These are my softer cello samples. And then what I'm going to do with those is I'm going to bring those down to a velocity of 100. So I can see the velocity right down in the bottom here is at, velocity high is at 96. So let's set that to 100. Then I'm going to go to my loud samples, and I'm going to drag them onto the same spot, and I'm going to put them at, up to the E flat right there. And then I'm going to take the velocity and drag it up until I get to 101. And then now what I've got is I've got a multi-sampled patch in Maschine, in the Maschine sampler. Multi-sampled, velocity layers, right? I don't think we can do round robin in here yet, but I sure hope they keep working on this sampler and add that kind of functionality, because it would be awesome. So now I've got a multi-sampled cello patch that I can use with Maschine Plus away from the software. I don't know what we're going to have as far as cellos go on the Maschine Plus standalone, but this just gives you an idea of the kind of things you could sample and then save them as user patches in Maschine. And to do that, we just right click on the patch and we go save as, and then you're going to save it as a sound in your Maschine menu. So a huge shout out to Av McCree. I know he is an MPC user, and we have a lot to learn from other pieces of software, and I think when there's competition, it's a healthy thing. So it's good for us to see what they've got and maybe ask if we can get that into Maschine, and vice versa. And I also think using other programs is definitely something that we as producers need to be ready to do. So check out the MPC software, check out Av's channel, and hit the subscribe button over here, and we'll see you in the next video.